Hello and welcome. This is Sergio Marrero here at the next episode of RBL1 Live. We have a great guest kicking off Women's History Month, Betsy Ludwig, who leads women's entrepreneurship at Northeastern University. Thanks for joining us, Betsy.
Hi, Sergio. Thanks for having me.
Of course, I'm excited to dive in. I'm a graduate of Northeastern University and have loved it and had an amazing time. And I'm sad that you weren't there when I was there, but I'm glad you're there. So just to share a little bit with the audience, Betsy is a graduate of Trinity College in Hartford. Also has her MBA from INSEAD, and also attended an executive education program at Kellogg. She has a background that is both entrepreneurial and investor, brought to Northeastern University, and she's going to share some of her stories. So super excited about that today. And then now has been the executive director at Northeastern University, focus on women in entrepreneurship. So super excited to dive into that. But if I can turn it over to you, and if you can share with the audience a little bit about Northeastern University and the Women's Entrepreneurship Initiative.
Oh, thanks so much, Sergio. I'm so happy to be here and talk to all of you about what we're doing at Northeastern University to really inspire the next generation of female founders. So I'll tell you a little bit about my background and my story, and then how this led into Northeastern University and what the amazing things we're doing both on campus and in some of our satellite campuses around the country and around the world to really foster this interdisciplinary community of next generation innovators. So my personal story is that when I graduated from Trinity, one of my first jobs out of college was working for a consulting firm in Boston. And they said to me, hey, we have a client over in Brussels. Can you go help them? They're a startup company. And I was like, oh, of course, like send me to Brussels. That sounds so fun. And so I got on a plane. They're like, oh, it'll be a 5-day assignment, maybe 2 weeks or something. And little did I know, I got to Brussels and I was the only kind of like under 50 person in the room, let alone the only 20 something. And they had hired in all these like senior execs from these big telecom companies. And they're like, we're building the first pan-European telecom operator. And this was at a period of time that there was like there were the monopolies. Each country had their own system, like France, Germany, England. And so this was going to be deregulated. And so it was an amazing, amazing opportunity. And we built this pan-European fiber optic backbone network. We were the first to do it. It eventually went public for $10 billion, sold off to KPN Quest at some stage after that. But that ride was quite amazing. And to have that be one of my first jobs and my first kind of forays into entrepreneurship, I was like, oh, this is easy. I can do this.
That's unbelievable. Yeah, not every day you hop on to a company and then it goes IPO and you're like, all right, like what's next?
Well, exactly. So for me, what was next? I went to business school. People are like, wait, you went to business school after you did the startup? I was like, yeah, whatever. Because in hindsight, in retrospect, and we're going to talk about this later in the show, I had massive imposter syndrome. I was this woman, I was working in Europe, like I didn't think I belonged, right? I didn't think I knew anything. Honestly, I had this stack of books on my desk. And, our marketing director would be like, we need a pricing strategy. And I'm like, okay, great. I'll read the book on pricing and like create a pricing strategy. And that's what I did. Like I spent all night reading that book. Another great story out of that was talking about imposter syndrome was we were doing the financing round for this, right? So we needed to get a vendor financing agreement from the people who were providing the equipment to us. It was about $150 million at the time. So I was doing all the spreadsheets and I was like the little nerd, doing all that stuff. And the night before we were supposed to go to Paris and negotiate this deal, my boss calls me, the head of the finance group, and he's like, I've just put my back out. You have to go to Paris and do this deal. And so I'm like, oh my God, like what? Like, I don't know. I don't even know what a debt equity ratio is at this point in time in my life, right, Sergio? So I get on the train to Paris. I end up in this conference room in these like legal offices. You can only imagine if you've been to Paris, like sitting in Place Madeleine, overlooking, these like beautiful old buildings. And I'm sitting there negotiating all of these terms and conditions and things and I keep running to the bathroom to call Peter on the phone and be like, is this okay? And he's like,
You
it's
couldn't
fine.
zoom Peter in. You couldn't zoom him in at the time.
There was no zooming. There was no internet then. I mean, honestly, and that's the funny thing, right? So we were building this fiber optic backbone network across Europe because the internet was coming. Okay, I know you must think I'm 150 years old, but anyway, it was. I would stand up at conferences and tell people like, one day you're going to be able to take a picture with your phone and you're going to want to send it, and people are like, no way. Anyway, so long story short, that was kind of my first experience. And so I ended up going to business school. And then after business school, I took a job with Lucent Technologies, which is also no longer. But I did that for multiple reasons. One, they had like this global leadership and development program, which was very cool for MBAs. And you got kind of an inside scoop on senior management, and that was interesting. But I also worked quite closely with the M&A group, and I was very interested on how big companies bought up smaller companies. I really wanted to understand that because I thought that if I was an entrepreneur one day and I wanted to sell my company to a bigger company as an exit strategy, like what was the process there? What was the thinking? Like what happened? And so I got a little bit of insight on that working at Lucent. I did learn that there's not a lot of method to the madness. That really, when I was there, the CEO at the time heard that maybe our competitor was going to buy a startup company in Israel. And so he hopped on a plane and spent $6 billion on a company that actually had no product. And really, he did that just to kind of take it off the market.
So you're saying that for a founder, you should just tell your acquirer that like see the rumors that somebody wants something like you are, and they'll come and buy you.
Yes, so study game theory and play poker, right? Like that's
there you go.
Like, that's what's going to take you really far, because it's not about, I mean, don't get me wrong, I don't want to like disparage a good old DCF. Everyone loves a good valuation, but at the end of the day, you are worth what someone is willing to pay. And people pay more when it gets emotional. And we all know that. It goes from everything from, buying a house to, the like impulse purchases at the cash register, and buying companies is really not that much different. So that was an interesting perspective. And then from Lucent, I actually was headhunted away to go work for a venture capital company in London. And it was actually a private equity company that was creating a new high-tech fund. So I went to work for them for a little while. And we did it was supposed to be more early stage, but it turned out to be more mid-stage investments in technology. And the majority of our investments was in California, and I was based in London. So that was like a lot of, I felt like I lived on British Airways back and forth. So that was really interesting. And that did teach me a lot about the rigor behind venture capital decisions, especially with the private equity lens and that background, right? Because normally the private equity company I worked for was buying up companies like Gucci, Tiffany, Saks Fifth Avenue, like real brick and mortar stuff. So the whole idea of investing in early stage tech, which obviously there's like no business plan, like there's nothing to sell yet, was kind of hard for them. So I learned that process. I learned a ton about finance, all sorts of, learned how to do a proper cap table and ratchet agreements and all that kind of stuff. And then I decided to get married and have kids. And so I decided I couldn't be on a plane all the time. And that wasn't kind of the right formula for my life. And so I started to do kind of lots of work with startups, mainly helping them with their pitch decks and putting them in touch with various venture capital companies around London, high net worth individuals, and then helping them negotiate those arrangements and valuations and such. And then after a while, I kind of it was like kind of exhausting to do all that work. I decided to do more of the interim COO role. So after a company had raised kind of their first seed round, like a few million, I'd come in and help them deploy that, like, and help them look at, what were the right sales strategies, what was, some of their policies and procedures, like basic value systems, like what's the value system of your company so you can hire and fire properly. And so I did a lot of that work. And then I moved back to the US after being abroad for 20 years. So that 5-day assignment turned into this 20-year kind of extravaganza across Europe and the Middle East and all over the world. And I came back to Boston and I was like, okay, what am I going to do? And I had lunch with a friend of mine, and she's like you, an HBS grad, and she runs a venture fund. And she was like, you need to go to Northeastern University because they're doing the most interesting things in entrepreneurship. And so I was like, okay, I went over, I had lunch, I started mentoring some of the startups that were going through some of their programs. And I got on my high horse one day about women in business, women in entrepreneurship, and how we're having the same conversation we had 20 years ago, and how, like, yeah, we make a little incremental change, but the needle should have moved more dramatically. And I'm just done with the glossy brochures and conferences, and I want systemic change. And so Northeastern said, hey, we have a job for you. And would you help us build some programs to really attract women to entrepreneurship? Because what they were seeing is what most college campuses see, which most entrepreneurship ecosystems see, is there's so many resources for entrepreneurs, but yet women aren't taking advantage of a lot of those resources. And kind of why is that? And what can you do to kind of change what those resources are, or the perception of those, to attract more women? Because at the end of the day, women are 51% of the world's population, and people solve problems for problems they relate to. So if you want to solve problems for women, you have to have women in that equation. And then, on the funder side, women invest in women. So you need more women in the investment pool. So that's kind of where we are. And at Northeastern, we have, really done amazing work in the last 3 years. We have kind of transformed the whole ecosystem. We created a student-led group called WISE, which is the Women's Interdisciplinary Society of Entrepreneurship. And what this group has done, which is so amazing, is created this very interdisciplinary group of women. And this is a really important part, because entrepreneurship is traditionally viewed by academic institutions as being out of the business school. And, well, you and I are MBAs and we can talk the talk. And so, DCFs don't intimidate us. That's very intimidating for a nurse out of like a health sciences school, or even like a computer scientist and a coder out of like a computer science school, or even like a chemist out of chemistry. And actually, we all know, if we've been in startups, you need all those people at the table. You need your designers, your web design, like you need them all. It's not just the business person. As much as the MBAs, we like to think that we solve all problems in the world, and we do, I'm sure. We need everybody at the table. And so through this lens of creating this interdisciplinary community and the cross-fertilization of ideas and that supporting network, we've transformed the whole ecosystem to be more interdisciplinary, and therefore attract a more diverse set of kind of talent, both from a gender perspective, from a race perspective, from a socioeconomic diversity perspective. So I've just said a lot. So I don't know if you have questions or you want to talk more about.
I love it. No, I appreciate you sharing that story, and there's so much to dive into, very rich. And I think also it shows that you kind of never know where the path may lead, right? And but if I rewind, back when you were first shifting, you said you were headhunted into VC. What made you make that jump?
So I think that's a great question. I think what I really liked was being on the funding side. I really wanted to help companies start up. I saw kind of the struggles of some companies not having enough liquidity and being so resource constrained, and I really wanted to help them grow. And I thought that being on the VC side, you could be working with multiple companies at the same time, right? So that's one of the reasons I wanted I wanted to do that. And also, money makes the world go round. So if you can understand how to get the money in the door and why VC invest in certain deals, then you could go off and be an entrepreneur and do whatever you wanted at some stage.
Awesome. And, shifting from, I will say, like, I'm definitely biased because at Northeastern we have, there's a range of different programs from the co-op program, right? And their bets on, on entrepreneurship now with IDEA. But I haven't seen many universities focus, having a person solely focus on women in entrepreneurship. Can you talk about like how that came about? And for you, did you first come there and then develop the role, or was the role there, and where have you taken it so far? If you can give a little more color.
It's such a good question, Sergio, and I am so lucky that Northeastern has decided to actually create this position, because what we've seen in the world is to create more diversity, you have to be more intentional about it. You can't just say, we're going to do some DEI initiatives, we're going to help women. You actually have to put resources behind it. And it has to start at the top of the organization. And that goes for whether it's a university or it's a company, whatever it is. So there are very few universities that have programs focused on women's entrepreneurship. There's like a handful that I can mention. I do meet people from other universities and they look at my business card before COVID and they were like, really, that's your title? Like, actually, that's a job. And so I think people are quite surprised that that's the case. But the job didn't exist. And I think that is something that's a pattern in my career, which is I've always been of the frame of mind of like, you make a job and you don't take a job, right? You look for the blank space, you look at where the problems are going and you suggest these kind of alternatives. And that has served me very, very well in my life, in my career, of just looking for that white space. Because that's what people, when you're a boss, like, you love it when people who are working for you kind of are like, hey, we need to solve this problem and this is how I'm going to do it. And like, let me go try. And you're like, go, like, let's see. And Northeastern is such an amazing university because they are so willing to take risk and so willing to try and understand where education is going. So they don't rest on their laurels. They don't kind of sit back and say, this is the way we've always done it. I do believe that Northeastern truly believes, and I think that's President Ayoun believes that, is that the problems of tomorrow are only going to be, more global, more interdisciplinary, more complex. And to solve those problems and be a true global leader in that, you have to understand so many perspectives. So to develop your entrepreneurial mindset and your innovative mindset as a student will set you up for great success. So yes, like, you'll graduate from college and you will just take a job, right? Because you can't sometimes make a job right out of college, but you will have that mindset and you will go into your companies or wherever you are and see certain problems that need to be solved. And when you can solve problems for companies, big or small, government or academia, people like that. Does that make sense? Absolutely.
No, that's great. And especially that when you talk about the interdisciplinary problems, even I wrote an article a while ago that talked about, what is it? The designer, the entrepreneur, and the developer, right? Or the not the entrepreneur, but the sales, design, development. Like,
right.
Like, investors are like, all right, like, tell me you have those things. Where do you have those things? So it's, and to narrow it down, they're like, you're either selling or building. I love the quote, you're either selling or building or getting in the way. But that's a early. One of the early investors, when I was pitching for funding, told me that. I was like, okay, great. I got, it's in terms of building your team early on. But yeah, I think the interdisciplinary definitely becoming more and more prevalent. But focusing on women in entrepreneurship, what are some of the unique things you all do in the program to specifically help female entrepreneurs?
Right. So thanks for that question, because it's very interesting and it is well thought out. So women, when you look at the research and you look at all the data of, I think you and I were chatting before this opened about some of the terrible data about the amount
Yeah,
of funding.
female founders share of venture capital shrank 2.2% in 2020. I mean, it was COVID and there's a difficult time, but proportionally, you would, you with all the talk on, elevating, underrepresented communities, you would thought that that might have changed, and it hasn't. So really curious as to what you all are doing in that regard, so we can more than move the needle.
Right. Well, I think, first of all, I think there's just a massive effort needed to just raise the collective consciousness, but like this is an issue, right? And then once you've raised it, a lot of people ask questions like, oh, but maybe there's just not so many women, maybe they don't go after as much money, all this kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, women do kind of suffer from a few things that kind of hold them back, right? And some of them are innate just by being women, and we talked about imposter syndrome a little bit, but women do have that more than men, although men absolutely do have it. Women, and that actually, I'll talk a little bit more about imposter syndrome. There's that whole thing about even men and women applying for a job, right? A man will apply for a job if he can check 3 of the 4 of the 10 boxes on the job description. And the woman will only apply for the job when she feels like she can check 8 to 9 or 10 of the boxes in the job description, thinking that she needs to have everything perfect. And actually, I do talk to a lot of students, and I do some work also at another college. And I was talking to one of their students, and she said, oh, I really want to be an entrepreneur one day, but I need to understand everything about it before I go into it. And I was like, no. The trick to starting something is starting it. Like, you're never gonna know everything.
It's
so
like,
you have to,
that's why I tell founders, like playing guitar. I was like, you can't study how to play guitar too long. You just got to play, and then you get better.
that's a great analogy. I don't play guitar, but I can absolutely see that. But you have to do that. And then that same concept goes into ideation. And this is pretty important, actually, because I've talked to a lot of senior women about this, and they're like, oh yeah, that's me. So women don't necessarily ideate like men do, right? So again, this kind of need for perfectionism, the fear of failure, they'll have an idea, but they'll hold it inside. They won't share it until it's perfect, right? And we all know there's no such thing as a perfect idea, right? And actually, what we also know is ideas are everywhere. It's execution that matters. It's getting the team. It's like knowing how to do things. It's making calls, taking risks, failing, but failing forward. And so what we've seen is creating an atmosphere to help women ideate. So I always kind of joke, and I'm sure that that's not the right thing to do, but like men can start a golf round, right? And be like, I have a new idea for company X. And by the end of the 18 holes of golf, they will have like formed the company, have suppliers in China, someone will have written a check for it. And like, they will have just started it and gone with it and been like, let's just see. A woman will just hold it inside and then never share that. And that's important for all women at all ages and stages. Because I've talked to pretty senior women in various industries, and I tell them about this phenomenon. They're like, wow, I've had an idea for so long and I've never like shared it with anyone. And I'm like, well, start now. So I think it's getting safe spaces for women to feel that they can share and find like-minded people, because in the ideation process, you're not only iterating on your idea every time you say it out loud, right? Like you're getting some kind of feedback, but you're also finding like-minded people to help take that idea forward, whether that's finding the co-founder, or whether that's finding suppliers in China, or whether that's just like an HR connection. And so some of the other things we see holding women back, which is especially important in the funding process, and we really should spend some time on this, which is the research shows that funders ask male founders and female founders different questions in the funding process. And this is really important to understand, because it happens by funders, whether they're a man or a woman, right? So that the gender on the other side doesn't necessarily matter as much, although I'm sure there's a little bit of a change. But what happens is men tend to focus on all the positive things during the pitch, and they tend to like have the next $1 billion company. Whereas women are natural risk mitigators. And this probably comes down to kind of genetics and women just risk mitigating because they have to take care of their family and they're protecting and they always have to have like a disaster scenario. But in the business world and in the founding world, they're very unwilling to make extrapolations, right? So they will much more rather indulge in a conversation, which is, well, what will you do if X happens to your business? A woman will have thought about 10 different scenarios of how she will mitigate that risk. But the conversations in those two scenarios, the woman will come out of kind of being a smaller company, not as exciting, like lots of T's crossed and I's dotted, whereas a man will come across as being like the next billion-dollar company. And I've talked to a lot of experts in the field about this, like even someone who runs a big accelerator program out in San Francisco. And she actually had equal number of men and women in her program. And I was like, how did you do that? Like, that's really incredible. And she said, we had to change our interview questions multiple times. She said, we would have men and women applying with the exact same business idea, the same target market, the whole thing. And there was orders of magnitude difference in the projections of the men versus the women. So that's just something that I think we have to coach women on a little bit. I think women are really uncomfortable talking about expansion. And I've seen this time and time again. I see so many business plans come across my desk from universities all over the country. And it's the first thing like that I'm like, why is your market so small? Like you're solving a big global complex problem. Like this could be $1 billion market. Like say that. Oh, but I don't know. We might not get there. So anyway, I'm digressing a little bit, but these are some of the things we talk about to help women. So at Northeastern, we have created a thought accelerator, is what we call it, which is a safe space for women to come through a program. So it's not really not an incubator, and it's not a proper accelerator. It's not coming in like what's your market segmentation? Let's do a DCF and all this kind of stuff. There is that element to it, but there are a lot of soft skills with that. It's how to communicate with confidence, how to negotiate, how like all of these things that don't necessarily come in some more formal accelerator program. So that's been incredibly helpful. And I'm very proud that before I started, we would have really like one woman standing in the pool of candidates in the Husky Startup Challenge, which is like, you know, our semester long contest. And now this past December, all 3 winners were women. They all had gone through WISE, and the first place person had gone through the Thought Accelerator the year before. So yeah, we're really happy with that.
Amazing. Can you share a little bit on what you've seen the impact of the pandemic have on female founders?
Oh God, Sergio, like this is such an interesting topic. And it kind of breaks my heart because the pandemic has been so awful on so many levels, as we all are well aware, and we're still living through it. But the pandemic has also been disproportionately hard for minorities, for working women, and for entrepreneurs. So it is this kind of perfect storm. And I'm very nervous that so much of the progress we were starting to see, I felt like the momentum was there to get behind the women, to get behind the minority founders. I feel like that's going to stall a little bit, mainly because, you know, women in general, like if you have kids, you're just keeping it together, right? You are just like, you know, one day at a time, and it's really hard. And I'm really afraid, especially with students, that they might lose their drive for entrepreneurship in this kind of craziness and go towards more traditional career paths. So I'm working very hard to kind of keep the momentum going, keep more programming, kind of get them more money. We've just launched the Women Who Empower Innovator Awards, try and really help our innovators and give them recognition and help leverage our networks as much as we can to help their businesses grow. So I think that this is a big problem, but I'm hoping that we can all solve it together by raising this awareness.
Amazing. Yeah, I'll share some more stats. Global venture funding rose 13% in 2020, but investments fell in women 27%. And I think looking deeper at the number, just to give a little clarity on what happened, it's not an excuse. It's just money. Investors, early stage investments actually decreased while later stage investments increased. and in terms of dollars. And so because more of the newer founders, right, are by percentage and representation are female, there's just less dollars went there, and they just moved over to a larger set of startups that are later stage, but more male representation. So there needs to, like you said, like there needs to be a conscious effort to keep kind of keep the ecosystem going, right? And to support founders at all stages. But yeah, really tough and terrible outcomes in that respect.
Yeah, but I think the important thing to remember is we all know like history repeats itself, right? And out of these chaotic moments, right, is where you find the genius and innovation. And so I think someone was telling me the other day, and I don't have all those stats in front of me, Sergio, I'm sorry, but the last financial crash in like 2008, 2009, like something like 11% of the NASDAQ weren't even companies at that point in time. Like, I don't think Uber was around. I don't think like Twitter had just started like in 2009. Like, like those companies hadn't capitalized, they hadn't gone IPO. So it is each setback is also this great opportunity to kind of get in there with new and different solutions. And I think that should not be underestimated, because I think in every crisis, is really where you find the true innovation and where you can find true entrepreneurs. And that's what I really try and tell the students, which is like, what are you seeing now on the ground? Like, let's go solve those problems, right? And I'm hoping that that's inspirational to them. And the world is changing, and changing really, really quickly. I don't know what you see on your side on that.
Yeah, I think it's for early stage founders, particularly female entrepreneurs. I think for us, it's we always try to make sure we're seeing them early. You're right; they tend to be a little bit not as audacious on the outset, but usually more thorough in their execution. So while they and I think that is I would say the average female founder it just ends up being just much more on point, and that's some of what we've seen. So hopefully the dollars flow that way, and there's I think that's I think the questions, well, at least my next question is, what do you believe in terms of the ecosystem that we need to do to have like an outstep change? So right now, if we're in the 2 to 3%, how do we 10x that, right? Even though it's not half, but how do we at least make a stepwise function? What do you feel needs to happen?
Oh God, Sergio. Like,
so broad open brush. If you were to paint, like what's the, is it's several things, right? Is it all the universities? Is it like combination with policy change, combination with half of the partners and all the VCs, elevate a female partner, which is beginning to happen, but you're beginning to move the needle, not quite as fast, but moving. Would love to
honestly,
any ideas.
Well, I wish I had a silver bullet for this problem, right? And even the president of Northeastern asked me one day, like when I had first started, he's like, so what do you need to do this? Like what? Because I said, we're going to create Northeastern to be like the #1 university for women to come study entrepreneurship, right? Like this is what we're going to do. And he's like, so what do you need? I'm like, well, it's just not that easy, and it's not just money, right? And that's the rub, right? A lot of people just think like, let's give women more money, and money helps. Like, don't get me wrong. And all those statistics, like we need to get those numbers up, but women lack, access to networks. So for instance, we just ran a program on how you leverage your networks. Like women don't ask for favors from their friends as readily as men do. Like, so you probably will think nothing of calling up your buddy and being like, hey, can you just get me that, whatever it is. Women like have some kind of inner angst about the whole thing. So we're trying to get them that. And on top of money, so access to capital, resources, and networks. So other resources of just kind of helping them, space or whatever it is that they might need. But to answer your question, I do want to talk for a minute about the philanthropy going on in the world to help women. Like I think Melinda Gates and Mackenzie Scott are doing amazing work to funnel a lot of philanthropy into women's organizations. I think that's going to go a long way. You know, they're doing all sorts of grant programs at Northeastern, which is a little bit unrelated to to entrepreneurship, but different. Our computer science school started something called the Align program, which is a mid-level career computer science degree that you can get, and it doesn't matter what your background is. So you don't have to have like any kind of computer science degree. And what we saw by doing this mid-level career, you can increase your earnings significantly through this program, but we saw a lot of women and a lot of minorities go into that program. And so Melinda Gates gave us a whole bunch of money so we could kind of franchise and replicate that model throughout universities in the country. So I think that there's like training that has to go in there. You know, you need women in every part of the equation. You know, when I look at I'm just actually bringing up some stats on my computer here right now. You know, if you look at Silicon Valley and you look at the big companies there doing innovation, you look at the Netflix, the Amazons, the Twitter, the Uber, Facebook, Apple, Google, you know, the whole FANG stocks, the tech jobs are still only, 15 to 20% women. And so if you're not having the women solving the problems, like everything's going to be coded for men, right? So it's it always reminds me of like that Mad Men episode when they're, trying to do the marketing advertising campaign for the tampons, and it's all like men in the room. So it's really hard. And what I loved about doing the Women Who Empower Innovation Awards, we're in the process of going through all the applications, is you have women solving some real healthcare needs for women, some, fashion needs, all sorts of different problems that they're solving, access to childcare, post-accelerator support, right? So a lot of women can go into an accelerator program and then they're kind of just dumped and left. So it's kind of like, hand holding them through all of these things. So I think that, I'm not really answering your question specifically, but I'm giving a few things that just really need to happen. And it's also just that true understanding that just because, you have a woman in the room doesn't mean you have diversity of thought in the room, right? And that's one thing I wanted to talk about, which was when I went to get my MBA, it was 16% women. And I think maybe about 6-7 years ago, I was at lunch with some of my female colleagues from business school, and someone said to me, why didn't they just take us in a room and explain to the women that it's going to be different for us, right? That we can be captains of industry, we can do all this stuff, but we still are going to have families and husbands and all that kind of stuff. And, disproportionate burden falls on the women to organize like the houses and like all this stuff. So, and I thought about that and I was like, she's right. Like they treated us at business school like we were men. They basically taught us how to be men, what to say. We were talking sports all the time, right? And so that isn't how you bring real new perspectives into the room. So I think for the men out there, I'm asked this question a lot, like, what can men do? Well, A, you can give women a voice, and B, you can really appreciate that women have a different perspective. And just because it's not your own and you don't understand it, doesn't mean it's not valid. And so you need to have more women in the room. And I don't know if that was clear.
No, that was great. That was great. It's like, it could be designed by and designed for, and it may be a completely different process altogether, and different needs and different skill sets. So that is great.
Yeah. And I mean, at Northeastern, we have this amazing robotics lab, right? And so you go in there and they're doing super cool stuff, like how to get Amazon packages to you faster with all these robots and trucks and all sorts of things. And then also like robots on how they manage fish, like to hold fish. Like it's actually really hard to get a robot to hold a piece of fish because each piece of fish is like a different size and all that. Anyway, I go through the robotics lab and I talk to the head of robotics. He's like, I'm all about women in robotics. I'm like, well, there are no women in here. And so I need robots like in my house to help me with all the kids stuff and all the house stuff, like who's designing all of that? And I do have 3 iRobots because I do love them, but you need to have women in the equation at every point to solve these big problems. And I do want to add that the statistics I've seen in the past from companies that have gone public they are disproportionately representative of a larger portion of money capitalization, women, female led, than the venture capital. So I think women get whatever, like 5% of venture capital, but they represent 18% of the unicorn companies that went public. That statistic was a few years ago, so I'm sure it's completely different now. But women do outperform quite often. So invest in women. That's my main theme here.
Love it. So we're actually, I was gonna ask you for a closing note, but I think we're gonna end on that. Invest in women. Thank you everyone for watching. This was Rebel One Live. Betsy Ludwig, executive director at Northeastern University, focused on women's entrepreneurship. Thank you very much for joining us tonight, Betsy.
Thank you, Sergio. Thank you so much. Happy